Hi, Jonathan Wosen. Thank you so much for joining us on the Down to a Science podcast. We are part of Smart Science, and one of the things that I'm very passionate about is careers in science, technology, and engineering, and the people who are in those fields, and try to get a sense of, how do they end up where they are. So, you are a science journalist. Can you tell me a little bit about where you work right now?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. So I write for a publication called Stat News. It's a national news outlet that covers health and medicine, science, biotech, pharma, that kind of thing. So it's an online publication. I work remotely from my home in San Diego. We have reporters all over the place covering health insurance, science policy, inequities in healthcare, biopharma, a whole bunch of topics.
There's really a lot to talk about and write about nowadays with so many things happening. We'll dig into all that. You are based in California and you have a PhD in immunology, and it's from Stanford, no less. And then you went on to do a master's in psychoms. I'm really curious about when you decided. Well, okay, let's back up a little. Let's go into you're a science journalist. That's your day job. How does a typical day or a week look like for you?
Well, one of the things that's fun and sometimes kind of exhausting sometimes about the job too is that there isn't necessarily a typical day. So today, for example, has been somewhat slower in the sense that I had a couple of calls and have been catching up on some notes for a story I'm working on. A couple of days ago, I spent almost the whole day at a biotech company here in San Diego County talking with the CEO and other executives about the strategy shift that they're in the middle of. There are days when we have breaking news that happens maybe late in the day, maybe early, but the closest thing to a typical day, I'd say, would be, I sort of start my day around 8-ish in the morning, and I'm looking through emails to see if there's any immediate quick story I need to jump on. If there isn't, I'm then maybe making calls or reaching out to sources for some story that I've been working on for a little bit of time, or maybe spending a bit of time writing something that I've done the interviews for. I just need to put a draft together, or might be responding to edits from an editor on a piece that I filed recently. So it's sort of a mix between rewriting, doing some early stage reporting to explore potential stories that don't always pan out. And so that keeps things different a little bit each day, and interesting and challenging too.
And that's everything is different. You don't know what you are going to be doing or a rough idea of how the day is going to go, but still pretty open.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's definitely a lot of variety. I think, when there's a ton of news coming at you left and right, obviously it gets a little busy, maybe a little hectic, and more hectic than I'd like. Other times of the year, and there's sort of a cycle to it too. So, things are less busy during the summer because, frankly, a lot of companies aren't announcing news and people are on vacation. Things slow down around the holidays. This time of year, September, you start to have more medical meetings happening and more sort of data readouts and things like that. So there's a rhythm to it.
So tell me about a story that you wrote and you worked on. Maybe there's more than one that really made an impact on you, or like personally. You're like, whoa, this shifted the way I thought of things.
Yeah, it's a good question. My last job before Stat, I was working for a newspaper, San Diego Union Tribune, covering local biotech. And I spent some time, this is around 2021, spent some time with a family here in San Diego, with this young boy who's got this really devastating and rare neurological disease. So he's got a rare mutation in this particular gene that causes him to have seizures, essentially every day of his life. Can't walk, can't talk, can't feed himself, requires round the clock care. So learning about that story and learning about just the degree to which his family's lives were impacted, his mother, he has two brothers, grandparents, So sort of seeing that impact, seeing everything his mother has done to try to get a diagnosis and ultimately a treatment for him was really, uh, that made an impression on me. I don't, I don't have kids. I don't have kids yet, but I think when you see the lengths to which parents go to care for their children, and in this case, you're talking about a disease where it's not like there is no known treatment or cure, and so she's sort of been going out and trying to raise money and push scientists to develop an effective therapy. Just seeing people kind of try to move heaven and earth to help their own kids was something that really left an impression on me. And I've talked to a few families who have gone through that type of very long, very lonely, very painful ordeal. But there's also some hope there too, because of some of the advancements that have happened in genetic medicine and in gene therapy potentially. So those are stories that stay with you for a while.
Yeah, really. Those are powerful stories. So uh, at what point in your academic journey did you realize that it's the writing and communication of such important work that's my calling?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I get that question every now and then when people figure out, when I tell them I have a PhD, they say, how did you go into journalism, or why and when? And, I am somebody who pretty much for most of my life, I was really set on being a scientist. I remember being in third grade and telling the elementary school principal that I wanted to be a lab technician. I'm not sure if I knew what a lab technician was, but
Sounded cool at that time, huh?
sounded cool, sounded like it had something to do with science and experiments and asking questions and sort of running experiments. So it seemed cool, and I was definitely very curious as a child. And as I learned a little bit about cells and tissues and the human body, got really fascinated with that inner world that we all have but don't fully understand. Right? We all have bodies. It doesn't necessarily mean we understand how they
Sure.
work, why they don't work.
Yeah.
And as I first heard a little bit about the immune system, what it was, why it does what it does, and how, I got really excited by the thought that there are all these microscopic, invisible battles happening inside of our body that keep us healthy until we get sick. And then there's a process to deal with that as well. So I just thought it was the coolest thing, and wanted to keep learning about it and wanted to be close to that. I was good at writing. I was good at that too. But to me, writing just seemed like a pastime, like a hobby. I would write short stories for myself, but I didn't have a vision or a sense of how to turn that into a concrete career path. And I was getting more support and mentorship from people in the science world. I didn't know anybody who was writing at all. So that is a pretty good summary of my mindset through high school, college, into graduate school at Stanford. So I came into the PhD program thinking that I want to be a researcher. I want to maybe have a lab one day and learn, discover new things about the immune system. So a couple of years into that, I realized, and maybe in hindsight, I should have realized it earlier, but I realized I just wasn't having a lot of fun, and I wasn't having as much fun as I thought I would have. Life in the lab felt very slow and tedious, and one step forward, two steps backward, which I think, frankly, is the experience of a lot of graduate students, postdocs, people who've done bench research before. But I also, it felt like there was more going on. I felt somehow that I wasn't using all the skills I had, and like I was getting so focused on this particular project about this particular immune pathway and these certain cells that I was losing sight of kind of the freewheeling curiosity that got me into science in the first place. So that was a weird thing to feel all of a sudden. And meanwhile, I was still taking some classes. You take some classes at the beginning of graduate school. And anytime I had to give a presentation or write a lay abstract or talk or write about science in that kind of way, I got really excited. And I felt like that was sort of, my time to shine, for lack of a better phrase. But of course, that was maybe less than 1% of what you do as a graduate
Yeah.
student. You're really in the lab driving your dissertation project forward, or trying to. So I felt like there was a disconnect between what I was good at, what I liked, and what I was doing with most of my time day to day. And it's funny. I did have this weird feeling in the back of my head that if I wasn't doing the science thing, that I might have become a journalist. I did. I was on the high school newspaper for a couple of years. Was a world news writer for one of those years, and editor in chief for another. And it was just the funnest thing I could have ever imagined, or to be interviewing students, fellow students, and teachers, and sort of learning new things about them, but then also sharing stories I was writing with classmates and with folks at school. So it felt fun, and somehow, and so in the back of my mind, I thought maybe I could have been a journalist, but I kind of thought, oh, it's too late. I'm on the science path. But I started revisiting that in the middle of graduate school, and I mean, lucky for me, there was a brief little mini course at the medical school at Stanford that a couple of science writers put together to try to share information about what it would be like to be an editor at a science journal, what it would be like to write for a university. And then there was a period, maybe 1 week, when they brought in people who were mostly journalists. So Joe Palca was a big science journalist at NPR, who I think retired a little while ago, but some other folks who had done science journalism, freelance work and staff work at different places. And I instantly related to them. I'd never met these people before, but somehow I felt like we were speaking the same language, or we were wired the same way. The interest in storytelling, in language, in addition to science. And so I wanted to be part of that world and looked for more opportunities to do so. But that was really the starting point. And then did some internships and did some other things we can talk about. But that was really the turning point for me.
I think the point that struck out to me was you were looking for something that you thought was fun to do, even though it might have been extremely hard. It was for you, it was real fun. Like for some people, they are all about research. They love the research. They can't wait to go back to the lab and try new experiments. But for others, that part is a drag. Everything outside of that is enjoyment. They love talking about it, they love sharing their knowledge. I think for somebody who is in graduate school, it is okay to be okay with not eventually realizing that, okay, maybe not pure research. There might be something else about this entire scientific journey that I am on that lights me up more than bench work or animal research or anything. And for me, it was at the risk of dating myself, even 25 years ago. I had to do an entire PhD and a postdoc before I realized, maybe not research for me. So, for anybody who's listening to this, just because you're in graduate school, don't feel like you are tied in and, just academic research is the only path forward. Pay attention. I think that's a great time to also explore. Like you said, you took additional courses. So, be on the lookout for opportunities that you are like, oh, that's interesting, and just follow that. It's not really too late.
Yeah, no, it's never too late. And yeah, for people who are grad student or postdoc, when you're at a university, you have access to all the different resources that come with being there, whether that's taking classes or professional development, mentorship resources, maybe at the career center, uh, alumni networks. I think culturally there's a lot of pressure to just go to lab, get your experiments done, write your papers, and then you feel like, okay, now I'm allowed to think about my future. But that's probably not the best way to do it. It sort of helps to be thinking about the next step, because in a way that helps you understand why you're doing what you're doing now. And it's also okay to not already have all the answers. I mean, there's part of me that maybe wishes I had already known from the beginning that science journalism was for me, but the journey was interesting, and I met a lot of good people and built some, good skills as a scientist that helped me today in journalism, and maybe we can talk about those. I met my wife in graduate school, so that was
There you
nice
go.
too. So it's okay. Life is a process, and it's not like you don't already have all the answers and then just go through the motions.
That's so true. So you talked about how, that PhD experience was not for nothing. It did prepare you for a career in journalism. Did it prepare you? Like, what were the skills that you, now looking back, you're like, oh, I actually did learn that in graduate school. It is helpful for me. So what are the skills that you think transferred really well into your career right now, what you're doing today?
I think there are a few of them, and skills is the right word, because it's more skills than it is specific knowledge of a particular pathway or aspect of biology. I mean, that happens too, for sure, but it is more transferable skills. So if I had to think about a couple of them, I mean, this is a really basic one, but I would say curiosity and work ethic are maybe two of the most important ones that will get you very far in journalism, and probably, I'd say, in pretty much anything. But yeah, as a journalist, curiosity is central to what we do. We're constantly asking questions all the time, right? So, and those are, as a scientist, curiosity about disease, curiosity about aging, about various changes that happen in life, about genes, DNA, RNA, epigenetics is important. So curiosity, work ethic, attention to detail, being able to read a paper is very helpful. I still read papers for stories that I write, because sometimes I write about particular papers, or sometimes I write about topics where I'm referring back to scientific papers. So that's helpful. Being able to make sense of data is helpful. Knowing what it's like to be a scientist has been helpful for me, because one of the things I've covered as a journalist has been the scientific workforce. So have written about essentially, what people who get trained in academia are doing with their life next, and some of the shifts that we're seeing there, the growing number of people who are going into industry writ large, biotech being a good chunk of that, but you can think about science policy, and even technically what I'm doing would be an example too. So for stories like that, I do lean on the fact that I've been a scientist before. I've written about issues in science, written about sexual misconduct in research environments, written about research misconduct, scientific misconduct. And so those are moments when sometimes when I'm talking with somebody, I'll go out of my way to say, hey, I worked in a lab. I know a little bit about the culture and some of the pressures that come with these places. So those are a few of the ways that it's helped me, I think.
Gives you street cred. That okay,
Yeah,
I know.
yeah.
So when you are doing writing today versus you've published papers, research, academic papers, scientific papers, how is it different? Many of the students or professionals who come from an academic background feel they can write mainstream because they have written an academic paper. Do you agree or?
But those two things don't go together. Those two things don't go. That's like saying, because I can speak Latin, I can speak Portuguese or something. Or that's kind of a
Thank
clunky
you. Thank you for
analogy, but
saying that.
yeah, I mean, and I've lived that, and I've seen other people struggle to do that. So yeah, I guess in theory you could think, if I can write for other professors or other researchers, of course I can write for a general audience because there's less sophistication. But it's so, I mean, the basic difference is that when you're writing a scientific paper, you're writing for an audience of experts who generally understand all the basic facts, who have a pretty good handle on why you're doing what you're doing, and who are going to be looking at your results to see how they fit in with maybe results that they've generated, who are going to be looking at your results maybe with the intention of replicating or building on those results going forward. So it's the audience is different. The purpose of the writing is different. And so you have to learn new things. You have to learn how to communicate to people who aren't already on board, who don't already know everything you know. It's hard to, I think it's an old adage, but it's hard to remember. Once you're an expert, it's hard to remember what it was like to not be an expert. But it's not just about, and it's not really about dumbing things down. That's a phrase that comes up a lot. I think it's about understanding what's important to the people you're writing for. So, if you're writing for sort of a non-expert audience, they may be less interested in the structure of the kinase and more interested in whether this could lead to safer, better, more affordable drugs, more interested in sort of practical day-to-day issues, more interested in access, whether scientific discoveries and advancements will be accessible, and if they're not, what sort of policies and practices are getting in the way of that. So it goes beyond simplifying because there's this whole other layer of what matters to other readers that you have to address. And that's a hard thing to understand immediately, when you're trying to write for a general audience for the first time.
I agree. And I think one of the other things that I tend to focus on now that I do communicate to the general audience is the so what aspect of any research, right? Why should somebody even care about it? But I remember as a PhD or a postdoc student, our focus was to communicate the science or the finding, right? The so what was almost as a conclusion in the very end. Like if you can reach till there, you can read it. But trying to shift that and almost, invert it, I think it's the biggest challenge somebody who comes from a very pure academic background needs to wrap their head around when they're communicating with the audience. Do you agree with
Yeah,
that?
exactly. And so I would say the parts of a scientific paper that come closest to the spirit of what journalists are doing would be the abstract, where you succinctly summarize what was found and what it may mean, and probably the discussion, as you said, which is at the very end. And sometimes, as a researcher, you don't really pay as much attention to that section because you're like, I know what reagents and what lot of antibody they ordered, and I've seen the figures. The discussion is just them waxing poetic about why this is important and why this is going to help us do organ transplants better or cure autoimmune disease. But that's actually really the
Yeah.
significance of the whole endeavor. And so that's something that I pay a little more attention to now as a reporter is what's the potential here? How do these findings move scientific discovery and learning forward in a way that could be good for public health?
So, as a science journalist, what is your most favorite part of your job that you just
And
love and you look forward to it?
yeah, I could tell you immediately. It's interviewing people. It's getting to meet
Really?
new people. Yeah, sort of what we're doing right now. Getting to meet new people who I'd never talk with otherwise, and learn about things that are sort of at the cutting edge of science. Learn about problems I didn't even know existed. Learn about solutions I didn't know existed to problems I didn't know existed. I guarantee you, if you were to interview or poll a bunch of journalists, that would be the number one thing that everybody loves about the job.
And what about the challenges, which is the part that you're not, it's part of the job, gotta do it.
Yeah, definitely some challenges too. I'm not really a big social media person. I'm just not. I have Twitter, I have LinkedIn for work, but I don't particularly enjoy it. So, and as a journalist, you do need to engage with people and also pay attention to what folks are saying on social media, because sometimes somebody will ask a question or make a remark that could lead to a good story. I actually had a story come out fairly recently, depending on when when this podcast comes out, that had to do with a bit of a back and forth between two biotech companies that played out on LinkedIn. But my natural inclination isn't really to pay much attention to that stuff. I enjoy, putting a quick story together, but sometimes the short deadlines can be, you know, especially when you've got another story you're working on and you sort of get interrupted by a bit of news that pops up, because the news doesn't care
Yeah.
what time of day it is or what else you have going on, or when you want to have dinner. Things just happen when they happen. So that's another tricky thing. And I would say maybe we'll get into it a bit more later, but there's a little bit of, media journalism is a business, and sometimes it's easy to forget that, but that business is facing a number of different challenges from different angles right now. And so working in journalism can feel very uncertain at times, even if you have a good job at a good place like I do. So that's another thing that can be difficult.
We'll talk about it. So I want to get into more of you. How do you find an idea of a story? How do you identify that an idea is worth writing as a story? And what is your process like? How do you go from that idea to a published story?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and that sort of gets to the central question of where do the stories come from? Where do they all come from? And they come in different ways from different places. So maybe I'll start with the least interesting but simplest answer. So I'm constantly getting emails from universities, from companies, from nonprofit organizations, maybe from certain government offices and agencies saying, hey, we just announced this, or we're doing that, or we're going to announce this in five days, and we wanted to give you an early look at it. So that happens a lot. Honestly, most of what comes to us that way isn't really story worthy. It's
Right.
just in the direct interest of whoever is sending that item. And of course, there's a whole ecosystem of public relations firms that are pitching ideas to us because that's their job. Nothing wrong with that. But I'm sort of looking at those and thinking, is this new? Is it new? Does it matter? Does it matter to our readers? How big of a deal is this? Is this a good story for stat? Because there are stories that are good, but maybe don't fit within the parameters of what we do. So health and science and medicine. So for example, a story about some cool aspect of how tree frogs live in the Amazon might be something I'd love to read, but it wouldn't really make sense for me to write it for our readership. So one of the ways that we do get some stories is just by people send us stuff and we look at it. That's not as interesting. We also get stories by going to conferences. So I was at a lung cancer conference a few weeks ago. I'll be at a hematology conference in December here in San Diego. Sometimes go to various conferences that focus on cancer and other topics, or that focus on just sort of the biotech industry writ large. So conferences can help. People sometimes, just individual people will send us tips. They'll say, hey, I'm a so-and-so at this university, and you won't believe what's going on here. Sometimes people inside of companies reach out to us to raise concerns. I've had that happen a number of times. And it's not necessarily the case that every time they tell us something that becomes a story. They might be wrong. They might sort of suspect something that's not actually true, but that requires some additional work to determine that, or maybe there's something there, but it's not that big of a deal. So it's a combination of tips, maybe colleagues sending you things that are on their radar, and editors having certain ideas. We may also sort of come up with an idea on your own based off of, looking at what's been written about a certain topic and identifying a sort of a gap in coverage. So everybody's talked about X, but no one's talked about Y. So it happens in different ways. And that speaks to the whole, I was mentioning earlier that no 2 days are the same, or every week is a little bit different. This is sort of why, because there's no tried and true way that's guaranteed to get you good stories. You kind of have, it's a little bit of fishing. Like, I fish for fun when I'm not doing work, and sometimes you come home with no bites. Sometimes you catch small stuff that you throw back because it's not worth it. And sometimes you're having fish tacos for dinner.
I love that. So once you have that, is there any specific method, like when you do your writing, do you have your unique way of doing it, or you're like, I just put a draft together and then come back and edit it, or you edit while you go? There are two kinds of people, let's say.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah. You're right. There are two camps of people, which I can touch on in a second. My approach, honestly, is very, I'd say, fairly structured and maybe kind of rigid. So I'm an outliner. I outline the story before I write it. I feel like that helps me avoid what sometimes has happened with certain stories, where I'll start writing and then I'll run into a dead end, or I'll kind of lose track of where I'm going. So I like to have a structure to refer back to. Now, once I'm actually in the mode of writing, I may not actually implement that outline the way that I envisioned, but I like that for starters. So I'll put together a little outline once I've done my interviews. And I do tend to try to do a little bit of editing as I'm writing. I tend to sort of put together a rough draft in bits and pieces that feel fairly polished to me, rather than write something that's pretty rough and then go back through it a couple times. That's something that I'm trying to be a little more flexible with, because, frankly, for efficiency and speed, sometimes it's good to just slap some ideas on there and then go back and move things around and tweak and trim and see if you need to add something. So I'm definitely in that camp of sort of having a more structured approach, I guess, to writing.
So as somebody who has you are an expert and you are to write to a general audience, how do you know, as you're writing, that the concept, supposedly it's a very complex concept, how do you know that you have made it accessible, written it in a way that is accessible to a general audience, like they get it? I feel like many experts, or people who really have that deep knowledge about a field, struggle with this, in trying to say, did I simplify the concept enough, or it's still not going to be understood? How do you determine that?
It's a good question. So, and it's something, so in terms of audience, so in my last job at the newspaper, I was definitely writing for a very general audience of people, in the general community here in San Diego. Stat is a little bit different in that we're writing for people who are sort of specifically going to us for health and science and biotech. So they do have some more background and a little more scientific background, or a little more understanding about how companies work, how biotech companies work. And so I write a bit differently today from how I was writing back in 2020 or 2021 when I had my last position. But it's definitely still, I think the question's still valid. It's it's hard to be completely sure that you've appropriately explained something. That's part of the reason why we have editors. So I don't just write the story and hit publish. I run it by somebody, and then we have a sort of a copy editor who also is a second editor who takes a look at something, and they're usually going to give you some feedback on a small little typo, but if something's completely unclear to them, they'll flag that as well. So really having other pairs of eyes who weren't the people who did the interviews and haven't been as immersed in the topic is really helpful. And that's honestly the main thing that I rely on. I think, sometimes you can gauge from reader feedback, whether that's an email or, a message on Twitter or LinkedIn, if people got it or if they were confused. So that's another way. But honestly, it's sort of, the editor plays a very important role in making sure that clarity is there.
What is your advice for people who think that who are trying to decide if science journalism is for them? Like, what are the kind of questions they should ask themselves before jumping into this career or trying to take this career seriously?
I think I would suggest at least two things. Maybe I'll come up with more by the time I'm done answering the
Let's start with
question.
two.
So I think the first thing, if you're interested in potentially in science writing or science journalism specifically, is just make sure that you're reading science writing. So check out the New York Times or the Atlantic or Science News or Stat News or whoever you like. Just make sure that you're reading it and see, is this something that resonates with you? Would you like to write in this way for that audience? So I guess the first advice for writing is reading for any number of reasons. And then the second advice for writing is writing. So looking for the lowest barrier to entry opportunity that you can get to do writing. That could be as simple as blogging, making your own little blog for fun. For me, that meant when I was in graduate school that there was a little group of students who put together a weekly science podcast. It used to be called Goggles Optional. So that was something that already existed, and I knew a person who was in that group, so I sort of asked if I could join them and started out writing scripts, and eventually was going over to KZSU, which is the radio studio on campus at Stanford, and co-hosting episodes. So just looking for low barrier opportunities to get some repetition, to get any kind of experience. It doesn't have to be spending a summer at the New York Times office. It can be just any opportunity to dabble. So I would say look for ways to dabble that are close to you. So if you're a graduate student in the genetics department at MIT, for example, maybe reach out to whoever runs the website for that department and ask if you can write short profiles of faculty or do little Q&As with people in your program and have them run that on the website. So just really low barrier, low commitment stuff, and just see, am I having fun? Am I enjoying the process? Is this right for me? So those are probably the two main things I'd recommend.
Just make it low barrier. I love that advice. My next question is, how important is, if they just do decide to get into science journalism, how important is an advanced science degree? Are there science journalists without a science degree?
For sure. Yeah, a lot of
Oh,
them.
okay.
A lot of them. There are people who are doing essentially what I do, who have more of a pure journalism background. So, they were on the high school paper, the college paper. They worked maybe at a small local paper covering city hall and courts and crime, and then eventually found their way into health and science writing. So there are a lot of people who take that path. I think increasingly there are people who do it the way I did, and there are probably people who do it in different ways too. So it's not, there's no prerequisite at all for doing science journalism. Basically, if and journalism in general, if you have the clips, which means if you have the portfolio of stories, that'll generally speak for itself. I mean, it's helpful to have a network, but you don't need a journalism degree from some big university or anything like that.
Okay, so you necessarily don't need a master's or a PhD in a science degree to get into science journalism, but do you need some sort of a psychom degree to get into it? Does it help, or just clips is good?
Yeah, I guess maybe as I'm saying this, you don't need any particular degree. Now, to
Okay,
be fair, I'm a guy with maybe too many
both those
degrees.
degrees.
I have both of them. I didn't get them because I felt they were absolutely necessary. The PhD, I was sort of on that science path already, as we talked about. And the reason why, after graduating from Stanford in 2019, I went on to get a master's in science communication was because as I was learning more about that world, I met a bunch of people who had been part of this science writing program at UC Santa Cruz that's been around for about 40 years and that has a really good track record of giving people the sort of tools and experience and support that they need to quickly find their way in science writing. So I had heard a lot of good things about the program. I knew the person who runs it, and also I was able to get some decent financial aid that covered my tuition. So it seemed like a good way within 1 year to learn a lot and do a lot and sort of accelerate my path to where I wanted to be. And it worked out. I actually I applied for and got my newspaper job while I was in the middle of that program. And the reason I got that job essentially was because I knew one of my classmates in the program had a friend who knew that there was a job opening. So I wouldn't have really gotten that piece
Yeah.
of information, I think, if I had been somewhere else. So anyway, you don't need a degree. I felt like in my case, it was going to ultimately save me some time in terms of maybe how many different places I'd have to hop to get to a good landing spot in journalism. But it's not a requirement.
So it's not required, but doesn't hurt to have it. So, based on your knowledge, if somebody is interested in getting one of these science journalism degrees, which ones are like the good ones around? Like, can you take an online course, or what's really some of the good ones that are worth putting your time into that you know of?
That's a good question. So, in terms of courses or online courses, I'm less sure.
Okay.
There's a lot of information out there that I can think of a couple of examples. So, there's a group and a website called the Open Notebook,
Okay.
which was created by a group of science writers, and it has a lot of helpful resources and answers to basic questions like how do you get started? How do you freelance? What is it like to be a science writer? So many of the things that we're talking about, do you need a degree? I'm sure they get into that. So the Open Notebook is a great resource that people could just check out by doing a quick Google search. There are books you can look at too. So I think the Science Writer's Handbook, I believe, that has a lot of practical information on the ins and outs of doing science writing. There probably are other resources, but those are a couple of the ones that come to mind. In terms of formal science writing programs, I mentioned the one at Santa Cruz. I think there's a good one at MIT. I think there are a few others in the country as well. But even at the level of books and online searching, you can learn a lot. And you can sort of the best science writing from 2020, 2019. There are books that sort of compile really nice science writing from magazines and websites, and so you can get an idea of the different styles of writing too. So those are all good places to look.
Yeah, I can put all of that information in the show notes for anybody who's interested. Where are the jobs at? Like, if hear this term science writer and science journalist kind of being used interchangeably, do you have a preference, or you're like they are two different roles and they are two different jobs that will you can get into?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was glad we can dive into that a little bit. So I would say, I'm pretty sure this is right. I mean, a science writer is anybody who writes about science. I'm a journalist, so which is a subset of science writing. So it's sort of like, chickens are birds, but not all birds are chickens, I guess. Um, so, journalism, maybe stating the obvious, but I work for a news outlet that is independent of the government, that's independent of any other company, that's independent of a university. So when I write about Stanford or UC San Diego or Ohio State University, I'm not on their payroll. They don't have any power over me. I'm independent, and that's sort of one of the things that's really important about journalism in society. So and we're not writing with the primary goal of making anybody look good or look bad. We may do that just based off of the facts and where the story takes us, but my main agenda isn't to make person X seem like the best person ever or company A seem like the best company ever. So that's journalism. Science writing is broader, and that includes a lot of very good and very important roles in, we could say, people who write for universities and who help communicate all of the impactful work that happens there to the wider community. So, institutional writing. And I know people who do that. I did an internship at Stanford School of Medicine's communications office for a summer right after I got my PhD. So there are people who do that, people who write for other sort of nonprofit organizations, people who do writing for maybe government agencies, the CDC or Health and Human Services. There are people who also do grant writing, which we haven't gotten into, and maybe is a bit different in terms of the audience. But there are researchers who need to write grants and need help writing them, and so that's one for people, one possible career route for people who want to stay close to the scientific process, but want to be maybe away from the bench. So that's a whole different thing. But there's there are plenty of, I think, professors and universities that'll pay for that. And of course, science writing, there are sort of people who work for companies and who write about what their company is doing. So that's the way I think about it. Journalism being a subset within that ecosystem of writing.
Wonderful. So, as we look into the future, how do you think science journalism is going to evolve in the coming years? I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes in the industry, in the field itself. And now, with the whole influx of AI coming in, what are your thoughts on where this is all going to end up and where the real opportunities are going to be for the young professionals who are just thinking of getting into the field?
Yeah, that's a really, really good, another really, really good question, and one that I think about a lot, and one that my colleagues think about a lot. And I think I won't pretend to know the perfect answer, but I'm happy to share some thoughts around all of that, because it is a really interesting, exciting time for science right now in terms of advancements in gene therapy, advancements in CRISPR gene editing technology, new cancer immunotherapy drugs that could be way more effective than what we already have. Researchers who are developing ways to use CAR T cells to treat autoimmune disease and not just cancer. There's a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of interesting stuff to write about. The business model that enables us to write about those things faces some challenges. And that sort of gets into what's been happening in journalism for a long time, which is that people don't really read print newspapers the way they used to. right? And there are a lot of local newspapers that have dried up. And if wherever you're living still has a local paper, it's a pretty safe bet that it's a smaller, lighter paper than it would have been 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's not as hefty. There's not quite as much in there. And that's because the ad revenue in the online world, the ad revenue in print has crashed. And so they've become more reliant on, and journalism has become increasingly reliant, I think, on readers paying, and for that being the main driver. But people, for all this time, didn't necessarily have to pay because it was an ad-driven model, or didn't have to pay as much. So there's some growing pains there, and a lot of good places shrinking or closing down, which is honestly tough to see. I think places that are doing relatively well have identified a topic for which there's an audience that cares a great deal about whatever you're writing, and that finds that coverage to be essential, and that is willing to pay for it. And so, it's stat for us, that's been biotech and biopharma, and we've expanded into covering health insurance companies and hospitals and science policy and other things too. But the bottom line being that we sort of figured out there are people who care about this stuff and who are willing to pay for it. And I think you're going to see more things like that in the future. And there are some other examples within health and science and medicine specifically. In terms of AI, which I think you asked about, right? Yeah, so in a way, there's a lot of uncertainty around what that's going to do. And then in another way, I could say I've been using AI for at least 7, maybe 8 years in writing stories. So I'll give you a really small but important example. So when I interview somebody, I'll generally take an audio recording of that interview and upload it to a service called Otter AI, which will use artificial intelligence to transcribe the interview. So rather than spend half an hour myself typing at a keyboard, I just give it a couple minutes. Maybe I go to the bathroom, get some coffee, and I'm good to go, right? So I can just immediately go into writing a story and pulling quotes from that transcript. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So that's something that a lot of journalists have been doing for some time. In terms of other applications of AI, it's interesting. So I guess in terms of things that are maybe a little concerning with generative AI, you could imagine, I think we're getting there, being able to quickly generate very quick, very short and sweet stories about small bits of news, things that are in the range of like 400, 500, 600 words. A clinical trial result came in from this company, and the phase 2 result tells us that this breast cancer drug is safe and may be effective, and the company is now going to do a phase 3 trial, and they're expecting to begin enrollment early next year. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that AI could turn around stories like that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because honestly, those aren't the most interesting stories for me. When you asked me earlier about a story that had personal impact, I talked about the story of a family, a young boy who's been living with a devastating disease. That's not the short and sweet story that AI can do. And I don't think that's a story AI would ever be able to do, because I met with the family in person. I spent time with the mom. I spent time walking around the backyard and through the neighborhood with them, and spent time with the grandparents. AI, as far as I know, can't do that, at least for now. So in a way, AI might free us up to use our empathy and our curiosity and our humanity. I think there will be some growing pains in that transition. But the way I see it, the 21st century is going to be very, very interesting, and there are going to be a lot of important stories, and I think there will continue to be a role for journalists in writing and covering those stories.
Thank you. That is probably the most beautiful and reassuring answer I've heard till date, because the general consensus, oh my God, AI is taking all our jobs. I was like, it's only taking the jobs that you want to be taken up. It will free us up to do the real work, the real creative work, the real human work that only we can do. So thank you for that answer. I love that. Do you have anything to share with our audience about you or anything else that I have not asked you?
Well, mostly just to thank you for the opportunity to talk about what I'm doing and why I do it and what I like about it. I maybe just a couple small things. If there's anybody who is listening to this conversation and wants to get in touch because they think, oh, I said something that you want to follow up on, or you have particular questions, uh, happy to find some time to do that. So my email, maybe we'll put it below the video, but my email is jonathan.wosen@statnews.com. So feel free to email me and to bug me if I don't get back to you. Speaking of stat, if there is anybody who's interested in keeping up to date with scientific discoveries, with decisions coming out of the FDA, the CDC, maybe you want to know what would the impact of the upcoming presidential election be on healthcare, what's each candidate's plan. Anybody who has any interest in health science and medicine, we do have we have a subscription model. I think I mentioned that we sort of ask folks to pay for some of the stories. We've got a really good discount for people who are in academia. So there's a 75% discount for anybody who is into that kind of thing. The code is academic75. That's all caps. So ACADEMIC 75. And if you're somebody at a university or an academic institution and you want to sort of get your university as a whole access to STAT, we've got even better offers for groups like that. And you can just shoot an email to groups@statnews.com. And I think they'd be happy to follow up with you about any of that. So thanks for letting me put that little plug in at the end.
Sure. No, I
It.
think this is amazing because some of the stories that I have read on stat are just super. So the fact that more people can access it with that discount is really something. So thank you. We'll put that discount code and the website into the description. So anybody who's interested, and Jonathan's email, we'll put it into the show notes, and anybody who's interested can check it out. Thank you so much, Jonathan. This is such an interesting conversation. I cannot wait for everybody to listen to it.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan.